Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Gimel, and Mirz Hashem today we will be learning Daf Kuf Nun Hey Amid Beis. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Shabbos. We pick up today on the top line of Kuf Nun Hey Amid Beis with a new Siman, Siman Shin Chaf Dalid, Dine Hachanas Michael LaBehema LeShabbos. The halachas that govern how you can prepare food for animals on Shabbos, Ubay Tesvav Seifim, and here we have 15 Seifim. Our learning today should be as close for Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael, Hanasunu Batzara Ubashivya, Ha'imdim Bein Bayam Ubein Bayabasha, Hamakayim Yerachem Aleihem V'Yetziah Mitzar L'Rvacha Me'afela La'ira, Umishibur L'Geula, Hashta Bagala V'Zman Kariv and Emar Main. Our learning should be as close to Refuah Shalema for Yeshua Levi ben Ahuva Malka Chana, for Yitzhak ben Tzion ben Dusha, Chavadasa Baserel, and Rivka bas Shiraleah. They should all have a Refuah Shalema B'Sar Shar Chayle Yisrael. So, says the Mechaber Sif Aleph, Ein Kaivrin Hateven B'Kvara. You cannot sift straw with a sifter, with a sieve, Sheyipal Hamoitz La'aretz, so that the chaff should fall to the ground. Now, precisely what are we speaking about over here? So I want you to imagine a stalk of wheat. Stalk of wheat is actually a very interesting thing. It's only the top of the stalk of wheat that we use in food production for humans, that we make flour out of. Not only is it only the top of the stalk of wheat that we use, but we use ultimately a very minute amount of the top of the stalk. We use the wheat kernel. The rest of the stalk, and indeed, even from the top, I guess you would call it the ear of grain. So if you visualize it in your mind, you've got that top of the stalk with kind of like the hairs and fibers that grow out of it, and inside you have the cluster of kernels. The stalk, the rest of the top, all of that is really animal fodder. We don't use it in for food, for our food. It's used for animal fodder. Now, what they used to do was they would take the stalk and they would not feed the stalk to the animals as is. They would take the stalk and they would break it up so that they would break it into smaller pieces. And then when it comes to the tip, we've already removed the grain, but you've got what's going to be referred to as the zakan. I think we're going to see a lashon, which literally means the beard, because the top of that stalk, again, you've got those hairy fibers coming out, right? Some of that is edible for animals, some of it is not edible for animals. So what they would do is they would break up the stalk and the top and everything else, and then they would put it into a coarse sifter. And then the parts that are not edible to the animal are smaller pieces that would fall through the sifter, and what's left in the sifter, that would be the part that would be fed to the animals. So the halacha that we're saying over here is, Ein kaivren hateven b'kvara, you're not allowed to sift this straw with a sifter, sheyipayel hamoitz la'aretz, so that the moitz, which is the chaff, but this is not the chaff that we usually speak about. When we speak about wheat chaff, then we're usually talking about the peel, the bran of the kernel. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the chaff, the waste material from the rest of the stalk that we're going to use for the animal. Sheyipal hamoitz la'aretz. You can't sift the straw so that this inedible moitz should fall through the sifter to the ground. Now let's pause here for a second and let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, nice cut and aleph, why can't you do this? Now if I stopped you right now and I would ask you why you can't do this, your response probably right away would be, what he means, Burr. Isn't this Burr 101? We're sifting, right? I mean, why is this Burr 101? Says the Mishnah Berurah, the reason this is also is mipnei shehu ke miraked, because it's like the malacha of meraked. Meraked is sifting. Meraked is ultimately a form of Burr, but it's ke miraked. Now, that sounds very much like this is not Meraked 101. This is not Meraked Daraisa. This is ki meraked. It's a like meraked, which usually connotes an issa d'Rabbanan. Now the question is, why is this only an issa d'Rabbanan? So let's take a look at a very important Shar HaTzion over here. Shar HaTzion Ois Katan Aleph. So the phraseology over here from the Mechaber is really coming very similar to the Rambam. And if you take a look here, the Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Aleph says Rambam Perek Chaf Aleph Halacha Beis. Now I have the Rambam right here, Perek Chaf Aleph Halacha Lamed Beis. The Rambam writes like this: Hamaraked me avos malachos. Sifting is one of the lamites malachos. Lefikach, therefore, ein koivrin es hateven bekvara. You're not allowed to sift straw with a sifter. V'lo yaniach hakavra sheyesh ba teven b'makom gavaya. We'll explain that in a minute. B'shvil sheyered hamoitz mipnei shehu ke meraked. So this is where the Mishnah Berurah is taking this from. The Mishnah Berurah is taking it from the Rambam that says that it's ki meraked. He doesn't say it's the Isser of Meraked. It's ki meraked. Let's go back to the Shar HaTzion. V'cheinu b'Yerushalmi. And Yerushalmi also says it's ki meraked, which again carries the connotation of an Issa d'Rabbanan, not an Issa d'Oraisa. Now, furthermore, says the Shar HaTzion, the Chavetz Chaim in the Shar HaTzion, Umash b'mimai d'kavala b'perek chaf aleph. From the fact that the Rambam chose to codify this halacha in Perek Chaf Aleph of Hilchos Shabbos, Shesham Mayri be'inyonei hashvusim. In Perek Chaf Aleph, the Rambam is discussing Yisrei D'Rabbanan. So the Rambam chose to codify this halacha in Perek Chaf Aleph, where he's talking about Yisrei D'Rabbanan. So it's mashma, says the Shar HaTzion, Dehu Rak Shvus, that this is only an Issa D'Rabbanan. So again, we have the Mechaber who says you can't do it. Now the Mechaber didn't use the lashon of chayiv, which would connote an Issa d'Oraisa. He didn't use the lashon of osir, which usually connotes an Issa d'Rabbanan. He just said ein koivrin atevin b'kvara. You can't do this. So the Mechaber a little bit didn't really tell us straight out. Issa d'Oraisa, Issa d'Rabbanan. The Mishnah Berurah says mipnei shehu ki meraked, because he's coming from the Rambam. The Rambam seems to very clearly imply that this is only an Issa d'Rabbanan. Why should it only be an Issa d'Rabbanan? Explains the Shar HaTzion, it seems that the Rambam held that this was unusual. It wasn't typical to go ahead and take straw and sift straw. That wasn't a common thing to do. I guess they just took the straw and they fed it to the animals. They didn't usually chop it up and then sift it. So this is not kedarkoi. This is not doing sifting in the normal way, because this is not a product that is usually sifted. And therefore it's kalach hayad. This is called doing something with a shinoi. It's mishoneh. And therefore it wouldn't be an Issa d'Oraisa. It would only be an Issa d'Rabbanan. Now Shar HaTzion ends off and he says, Va'ayin b'Rashi. He does send us to Rashi in Masechta Shabbos Kuf Mem Amid Aleph. Now Rashi is much more, Rashi seems to imply, I have it over here, 1 second. Let me get back there. Rashi is more mashma that it's a daraisa, because Rashi says, let me find it. Kuf mem. I thought it was up here. No, where is it? Where's the Rashi? Mites. Oh, here it is. So the Mishnah over here says, Ein koivrin es hateven b'kvara. You can't go ahead and sift the straw with a sifter. And you can't do this b'shvil sheyerid hamoitz, so that the moitz, the chaff, should fall out. Says Rashi, moitz, hum mizekan hashibolos ha'elyon. This is the beard of the top of the stalk. Those are those fibers that come out on the top. That's what the moitz is. Ve'enoi royal l'meichel, and that's not even royal l'meichel behema. Therefore, Rashi says, v'koivrin oisai b'kvarin, they would sift it with sifters, sheyipal ha'moitz, so that this moitz should fall through the sifter. So from Rashi, it seems that this certainly is the derech. V'koivrin oisai b'kvara. They would sift it with a sifter, in which case it would be an issa daraisa. But coming from the Rambam, it seems to be an issa darabanan. So now let's go back into the Mechaber. So halacha number 1 in the Mechaber here in Sif Aleph, ein karven ateven b'kvara she'yipar lamoitz la'aretz. You're not allowed to sift the straw with a sifter so that the moitz, this inedible chaff from the top of the stalk, should fall through the sifter and fall to the ground. You're not allowed to do this. Why, said the Mishnah Berurah? Because it's kim meraked, which implies it's an issa d'rabbanan. Next thing. V'lo yanichenu b'makom gevaya k'dei sheyered hamoitz. Now, literally what these words mean is, nor can you place it in a high place so that the chaff should fall down. Now, the question is, precisely what does this phrase mean? Now, v'lo yanichenu means you cannot place it. The question is, what's the subject? What's the object of it? What is the it over here? Now, yanichenu is a lashon zachar, and therefore the word yanichenu we would think means the teven. And v'lo yanichenu b'makom gavaya would mean you cannot take the teven and put it, the teven, into a high place so that the moitz should fall away. Now, there are those that learn pshat like that. The Meiri learns pshat like that in the Mishnah in Masechta Shabbos. And the way he understands this case is that there are 2 different ways you could separate out this moitz from the teven. One is you could sift it with a sifter. The other one is you could take a pile of this teven, put it up in a high place where it's going to be exposed to the wind, and the breeze is going to come and it's going to blow away the moitz. So that's the way the Meiri learns the Mishnah. But that's not the way the Rambam learns it. And I wrote down over here the lashon of the Rambam. The lashon of the Rambam is v'lo yaniach hakevara sheyesh ba teven. You're not allowed to take the sifter that has the teven and put it b'makom gavaya into a high place b'shvil sheyered hamoitz. So it sounds from the Rambam that this is not 2 different cases. One case is you're using the sifter to sift it. The other one is that you're taking a pile of teven, putting it somewhere where it's exposed to the wind, and letting the wind blow away the moitz. Again, you're still using the sifter. So exactly what are the 2 different cases over here? I don't know. Case number 1 is ein koivrin hateven b'kvara. You can't go and actively sift the teven. Case number 2 somehow is you're taking the kvara with the teven and you're putting it somewhere and letting it do its thing. In either way, you're not allowed to do either one. Let's see, ice cotton bays, hateven. The Mishnah Berurah just explains this scenario to us the way I explained it to you at the beginning of the shir. What are we talking over here when we talk about sifting teven for animals? Explains the Mishnah Berurah, they would take the stalks and they would break it up with tools called moirigin. Moirigin were either some kind of boards that had teeth that they would use to beat the stalks, to break up the stalks, or it was like a hammer-like device that was also used to beat up the stalks, but this was a tool that was used to break up the stalks. V'oisin kol znav hashiboilus teven. By doing this, they would take the znav hashiboilus. Literally, that means the tail of the stalk. It means the whole bottom of the stalk. They would break up the stalk to break it into smaller pieces of straw to use it for animal fodder. The moitz that we're talking about here are the hairs and the fibers, the inedible part of the top of the stalk where the grain is inside there. That part of the stalk is not even royal l'maichel behema. The koiver and therefore they would sift it kadei sheyipal hamoitz so that the moitz would fall out and they could remove the moitz. V'ashmi'inon da'afilu zeh aser b'Shabbos. The Mechaber is telling me over here that even this sifting is aser on Shabbos. V'choshkein de'ein l'raket atfua mipselus shelahen. Certainly you're not allowed to sift grain from the bran or from the chaff. Tezeu merakid mamish v'chayev, because that would be the ikar malacha of merakid, and that would be an issa daraisa. What did the Mishnah Berurah just tell me here? The Mishnah Berurah is telling you here that the Mechaber is telling you, You might look at the malacha of meraked. What's the malacha of meraked? High level. The malacha of meraked is when you harvest your grain. Now you have your wheat kernels. The wheat kernel itself is edible for humans. We take it, we make flour out of it. But we need to remove the chaff. What chaff are we talking about? The chaff that's outside the kernel. So meraked 101, the Iker Malacha of meraked, is talking about food that is fit for human consumption. And we're removing the chaff, which is inedible for us, and we're leaving over the kernel, which is edible for us. The Mechaber is telling us over here, you might think that when we're talking about ma'chale behema, when we're talking about animal fodder, now we're not talking about anything that's edible for humans and parts that are inedible for humans. None of this is edible for humans. We're talking about the stalk, and we're talking about the inedible part of the top of the stalk. None of this is edible for humans. Some of it isn't even royal ma'chale behema. You might think that there's no issa meraked. Maybe the issa meraked only talks about human consumption, separating edible from inedible. Who says it applies to ma'chale behema? Says the Mechaber, no, it does. It applies even over here. Certainly, when you're dealing with grain that we could eat, then certainly it's meraked mamish v'chayev. Oiskat gimel noifam le'elav derech nikvei hakvara. The mites would fall through the big holes of this sifter. Okay, so wait, we're not finished. Let's go back into the Mechaber. We have one more halacha here in Sif Aleph. First halacha of Sif Aleph, you can't sift the straw. You can't even take the sifter with the straw and put it up somewhere high and let it do its thing. Let the mites fall through. Aval, however, what you could do is, noitel b'kvar. You could take a sifter, you could scoop up a sifter full of straw, v'noised l'saycha evus, and then transport it to the feeding trough and dump the straw into the feeding trough. So you've got a big pile of straw, and you need to transport straw from the pile of straw to the feeding trough where the animals are going to come eat. Says the Mechaber, you could go use the sifter as your keli. You could scoop up a thing of straw, transport it to the feeding trough, and dump it into the feeding trough. Even though the chaff is going to fall through the holes of the kvara when you do this, mutter, it's still mutter. Why? Because it's a davar she'ena miskaven. You're not being mechaven to sift the straw. You're doing this only because you want to transport the straw from the pile to the trough. That's the only reason you're doing it. You're not doing it for the purposes of sifting. It's a davar she'ena miskaven, it's mutter. It would seem that this is not a psik reisha. If it was a psik reisha, it would be a psik reisha on an issa d'Rabbanan, and the Mishnah Berurah paskined earlier that we are noyeg l'chumra, that when you have an issa d'Rabbanan, a davar she'ena miskaven, but it's a psik reisha, it's ulcer. So if we're being matter this over here, it must be that it's not a psik reisha. Moving along to Sif Bey's third line down, says the Mechaber. All right, so you have your straw, or you have your animal fodder. In Sif Beis, we're going to be discussing barley. And you want to go ahead and you want to feed your animal. Now, you keep track of what you feed your animal. So you want to feed your animal a specific measure of barley. Are you allowed to measure it out? Says the Mechaber, Lo yimdoid adam sa'irim. You're not allowed to measure out barley, laseis lifnei behemtoi, in order to give it to your animal to eat. Ela misha'er ba'imid daitoi. Instead of measuring it out precisely, you have to take, let's say, a bucket and scoop up a bucket and look and say, okay, that looks like it's about the right amount. But you cannot measure out. Why? Because medida, measuring, is also on Shabbos. Why? Uvdin d'chayil. Mekach memkar, similarity to mekach memkar, uvdin d'chayil. You're not allowed to do medida. So again, over here, you're not allowed to do medida in order to measure out the food for your animal. Says the Mishnah Berurah, cotton dal lo yimdoid hainu b'klei hamida. The Mechaber is telling you you're not allowed to use a measuring utensil to precisely measure out the grain you're going to give your animal. Why? Because this has the appearance, it has the optics of mekach umemkar, it's uvdin dechoil, it is aser. Avalikach bekli acher, but to scoop up grain in a bucket or some other kind of keli, ulishaer kavoi kabayim, and to estimate, I like to give my cow a kav of barley. So you take a bucket and you scoop up a bucket of barley. Yeah, that's about a kav. That you're allowed to do. Mutter. That's what the Mechaber means, that you could be Meshayr. V'ayin be'eliyah Rabbah. Moving along to Sif Gimel. Now, in Sif Gimel, we're going to be worried about the Isser of Lush. Now let's remember discussing the Isser of Lush. Lush is to knead, K-N-E-A-D. What is the malacha of kneading? You take flour. Flour is very tiny particles of solids. And then you take a liquid agent. In the case of dough, you take water. You introduce it to the dry particles, to the flour, and you knead it into a unified mass. That is Lush 101. That's one of the Avos Balachais. That would be an Isser Daraisa. Now, whenever we discuss the malacha of Lush, first we categorize your solids into two different categories. There are solids like flour that are called bar gibel. Those are substances that when you add a liquid binding agent to them, they bind and they form one unified mass, like when you take flour and you add water and you form a dough. That is Issa Daraisa of Lush. Then there are dry substances that are lav bar gibel. We say that they don't really knead into a unified mass. One of the examples we saw when we learned this was ash. Apparently, I never tried it, but apparently you add water to ash, it doesn't form one new substance, a dough, one unified dough. It might become clumpy, but the reason it becomes clumpy is because the different pieces, the individual pieces of ash, are like sticking to each other. But they're still individual pieces. It doesn't really bind to one new unified mass. So that's something which is a lav bar gibel. Now, there's a difference in halacha between a bar gibel and a lav bar gibel. And we're working in the world of the Mechaber. The Mechaber largely paskins like the Rambam. So the Rambam holds that when you do lush on something like flour, which is a bar gibel, that's an Issa Daraisa. You do lush on something like ash, which is not a bar gibel, that's only an Issa Darabanan. That's not an Issa Daraisa of lush, it's only an Issa Darabanan. So that's one thing we have to bear in mind. The difference between a bar gibel, lush is an Issa Daraisa, something that's a lav bar gibel, lush is an Issa Darabanan. Now we have another question. When we talk about lush, when we talk about kneading, we're usually talking about the act of, you have the dry ingredients, you add the liquid agent, and then you do lush. Then you take your hand, or you take a keli, or you take a KitchenAid, and you go ahead and you knead it. You do the action of lush. You actually actively go ahead and knead it into a mass. But how about simply adding the liquid agent into the dry ingredients? When you take water and you pour it into dough, to a certain extent, lush takes place automatically. As soon as the water hits the flour, a certain amount of flour is going to combine and start forming dough. So, what is that? Is that an Isser of lush? Simply adding the water? Is that lush? So again, we're paskening here like the Rambam. And we discussed, I'm not going to go back into the Machlokes Tanoim, the Machlokes Rishonim, we covered that already. We're doing a high level here. We're paskening like the Rambam. The Rambam holds that to take liquid and add it into dry ingredients like flour that are bar gibel, that's an Issa Darabanan. The actual act of kneading a bar gibel is an Issa Daraisa. Simply introducing the liquid into a bar gibel is an Issa Darabanan. How about adding liquid to something that's not a bar gibel? Simply adding liquid to a dry substance which is not a bar gibel, the Rambam holds is mutter legamri. Why? Because when something's not a bar gibel, the Rambam holds that even kneading it is only an Issa D'Rabbanan. So if even kneading it is only an Issa D'Rabbanan, simply introducing the liquid is not even an Issa D'Rabbanan, that's Mutar Lagamri. Okay, against that backdrop, we can now see Sif Gimel. Says the Mechaber Sif Gimel, Ein goivlin mursan lebehema oilard oila tarnagolim. You're not allowed to knead, K-N-E-A-D, you're not allowed to actually do lush on mursan. What's mursan? Mursan is bran. What's bran? Bran is the chaff that we take off the kernel. When we want to produce white flour, we remove the wheat bran from around the kernel. Now that wheat bran was edible for animals. It's even edible, right? Whole wheat bread, it's even edible for us, the bran. But the bran is certainly a Michael Behema. But they wouldn't take the dry bran and serve it to an animal. They would mix it with water, and they would make, I guess, like a slurry or like a cereal, I guess, kind of. And that's the way they would serve it to the animals. Says the Mechaber, Ein goivlin mursal lebehema l'tarnagolim. You're not allowed to go ahead and do lush on mursan in order to feed it to behemoths or to poultry. Why not? So the Mishnah Berurah is going to tell us that mursan, according to the Rambam, is considered lav bar gibel. Mursan doesn't really form a unified dough. It's a lav bar gibel. Okay, let's do the math. It's a lav bar gibel. To actually do lush is an issa d'Rabbanan. So therefore, says the Mechaber, Ein goivlin mursal lebehema l'tarnagolim, because to do so would be an issa d'Rabbanan. You're doing lush on something which is lav bar gibel. Issa d'Rabbanan, you know how to do it. Aval noistin by mayim. But you are allowed to introduce water into the mursan. To simply pour water into the mursan, you're allowed to do. Why? Because again, let's do the math. You have mursan, it's a lav bar gibel. You're not doing lush, you're simply adding water. Adding water to something that's a lav bar gibel, the Rambam holds, is mutar lagamri. And the Mechaber is coming off of the Rambam. So again, first halacha, Ein goivlin mursal lebehema l'tarnagolim. You're not actually allowed to do lush on mursan for your animals or for your chickens, because mursan is a davar that's a lav bar gibel. To do lush would be an issa d'Rabbanan. Aval noistin by mayim, but you could introduce water to the mursan, because that, according to the Rambam, is mutar lagamri. You're simply introducing liquid to something which is a lav bar gibel, that you could do. Furthermore, says the Mechaber, so now you've gone and you've introduced the liquid. But that's not enough to feed it to the animals. You can't just pour the water into the mursan and now feed it to the animals. You have to mix it somehow. To do lush, you can't do. It's a d'Rabbanan. Says the Mechaber, what you could do is, umaver by tarvod, you could take a tarvod, which was a very large mixing spoon. You could take a tarvod, or makel, or you could take a stick, and you could pass it through this wet mursan, shesi ve'eriv. You could go up and down in the mixture, and then you could go right to left in the mixture. Now, when I say up and down, I don't mean up and down. I mean up and down, left and right. So that's the way you can mix it. You can't do lush, because to do lush would be an issa d'Rabbanan. But now what you're doing with a shinui. Now you're doing lush in a mishunadik way. You're taking the spoon and you're just going up, down, left, right, up, down, left, right. You're not going round and round and round. So now you're doing lush d'Rabbanan, because you're doing lush on something that's a lav bar gibel, and you're doing it with a shinui, and you're doing it in order to feed animals that you have a responsibility to feed. So that, the Mechaber says, is mutar. And the Mechaber continues, why is this mutar? Since you're not mixing it with your hands, you're not turning the spoon or the stick around and around and around. Mutar. This is mutar. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cotton hay. Ein goivlin, after Eina bar gibel, even though this mursan, this bran, is considered a davar de Eina bar gibel, mikamakam gazer rabbanan, it's still an issa d'Rabbanan, shema yava legabel kemach dechayiv bisham lush. Why is it usher to do lush on something which is not a bar gibel? Because if we let you do lush on something that's not a bar gibel, you might come to do lush on something which is a bar gibel, which would be an issa daraisa. So this is exera. V'das haber rishonim da'af b'mursan chayv mishum lush. The Mishnah Berurah does caution us that there are many rishonim who hold that mursan is a bar gibel, and therefore lush would be an issa daraisa. V'ayin b'bir halacha. Ois kat vav mursan ve'ein chilik bein megabel harbe oy ma'at ma'at. There is no heter over here by mursan. We saw when we learned the halachas of lush, we learned that there are certain types of flowers, etc., where there's a heter to do lush in a small amount. Over here, that heter does not apply. Ois kat zayin avol noistin by mayim. But you are allowed to simply introduce water into the mursan, and I explained that's because simply introducing liquid into something which is a lav bar gibel, the Rambam holds is mutar legamri. Now says the Mishnah Berurah, can you do this with actual flour in order to feed your animals? Can you simply introduce liquid into flour, which is a bar gibel, and then mix it with a shinoi? Ayin b'tar shekasav dezeh talyu b'shitas hapaiskim. The Rambam also, according to the Rambam, it's definitely aser. V'shela arei paiskim mutter, but there are paiskim who would say it's mutter. V'chol zelodeh kamaisazu. This is all according to the first opinion that we're learning here. Avaladasa yesh oisrim shuhuva b'seif asif. But according to the most stringent opinion, we're going to learn at the end of the sif. The sviralu who hold the afilu l'seich hamursan also lited mayim, that you're not even allowed to introduce liquid into mursan. Mishum denesidas hamayim zeu gibuloi, because we had this shita where we learnt lush. There is a much more machmer shita who holds that something which is a lav bar gibel is actually in one way more stringent, more chamor than something that is a bar gibel. And what is that? Well, by something that's a bar gibel, simply adding the liquid is only an issa d'Rabbanan, because that's not the way you need flour. You add water and then you mix it. But by something that's a lav bar gibel, there are those rishonim that hold that simply adding the liquid is already an issa daraisa. Why would that be? Because mixing it is not going to make it any more into a dough. By something which is a lav bar gibel, it's not really going to combine. So there's no yichus. There's no, when you actually go do the lush, you're not doing anything. So just by adding the water, you already did whatever level of gibel could be done. And therefore there are those shitas that hold that a lav bar gibel, in a sense, is more chamor. You're not even allowed to just add the liquid because that is the lush by something which is a lav bar gibel. Kol sheken l'seicha kemach to b'chlal gibel, certainly it would be usher to add it to regular flour. Ois kad ches, this is mutter, to just introduce the liquid and then mix it with a shinoi. But if you mix it with your hand, or you take the mixing spoon and you mix it in a circular motion near a kalash, then it looks like you're doing lush, and that again would be an issa d'Rabbanan. Says the Mechaber Viter, okay, not only could you do this, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines off the bottom, another way that you could mix this. So you have your mursan, you pour it in water, but now you still need to mix it. Or you could take the mixture of the mursan and the water, and you could pour it back and forth from one keli to another. You could go ahead and you could mix the mursan in one keli, and then you could divide it up into a bunch of other kelim, and put a separate keli in front of each animal. And you're even allowed to produce a tremendous amount of this. If you have one keli, you could fill it up even with a kur or a karayim of mursan, and you could mix up a very large batch. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Tes afilu kur, v'hu sheshir zet tzarich le'lechalik lifneihem ba'oisa yom HaShabbos. Of course, you're only allowed to mix what you're going to use on that Shabbos. The lavachi, because to mix something that you're not going to use on that Shabbos, also l'troich tircha deloy tzricha, that would be a tircha yisera, and also hachana, you would not be allowed to do that. Continues the Mechaber 3 lines off the bottom. And now we have this more stringent opinion that the Mishnah Berurah was referring to. V'yesh oisrim litain mayim al gaber mursan b'Shabbos. There is a more stringent opinion. There is the shita of the smag and the smak that says that you're not even allowed to introduce water into the mursan on Shabbos. V'loy amru shemalach by shesi ve'erev. And the Chazal didn't give this kula of mixing it with a shinui, mixing it shesi ve'erev, ela kishayu amayim nesun alav miba'od yoyim. In other words, there is a more stringent opinion, there's a machmer opinion here, who says that on Shabbos you can't pour water into Mursan. And like the Mishnah Berurah said, that's because they hold that Mursan is a bar gibel. So you can't pour water into the Mursan. So then, what's pshat in the Gemara when the Gemara says that you could mix morson for animals by mixing it shesi ve'erev? That's only if you put in the water before Shabbos. If you put in the water before Shabbos, then on Shabbos you could mix it shesi ve'erev. El kishayu amayim nesunin alav miba'od yoyim. V'ayila'el siman shin chaf aleph. The Ramah sends us back to shin chaf aleph, where we discussed the halachas of lush in detail. Sifteh zayin, gabi shum v'chardol ketzad noyagin, how you mix up garlic and mustard, and we learned those halachas in great detail. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Yod, v'yesh oisrim, hu das bal hatruma v'siyatoi. This is the shita of the bal hatruma and those Rishonim who agree with him. The paiskin kerebi, who paskin like Rebbe, and Rebbe's machlokes with Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda. The Sfira lay, Rebbe is very machben. Rebbe holds that the medicinas mayim lechud chayiv. Rebbe holds that even simply introducing liquid into dry ingredients is already in Issa Daraisa. We said the Rambam paskins like Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda. The Rambam holds that even introducing water into something like flour, which is a bar gibel, is only an Issa Darabanan. The Rambam holds the Issa Daraisa of lush is only when you actually need it. Pouring water in, that's not lush Daraisa, that's only lush Darabanan. But the Baal Truma and others paskin like Rebbe. Rebbe is much more machmir than Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda. Rebbe holds that simply introducing water into flour is already an Issa Daraisa. So who das bal truma v'siyate the paiskin kerebi desferle the benesinas mayim lechud chayiv b'shem gibel bekemach, whether we're dealing with flour uva morson or we're dealing with something which is a lav bar gibel like morson ube afer or like ash ube choldover. The Baal Trumas holds that any time you add liquid to a dry ingredient, even if it's a lav bar gibel, that's lush daraisa. So therefore, if you have to do this for your animals, you have to add the liquid ingredient before Shabbos. And even if you add the liquid before Shabbos, also you still can't do lush. You have to do it with a shinoi. You have to do shesi ve'erev. Ois Katan Yod Aleph. The Ramah sent us back to Siman Shin Chaf Aleph, where we discussed the halachas of chardal, of mustard, in great detail. Ritzayin Aloymar, what the Ramah wants to say over here is, the Sham Nispaer, over there in Shin Chaf Aleph, we explained, the Noihagin Lahachmer Kisfaras Bal Hatruma, that we are noig to be machmer like the Bal Hatruma, that any time you add the liquid ingredient to the dry ingredients, even by a davar that's not a bar gibel, that is lush. It's an Issa Daraisa. The Kasav HaChayadam, the HaChayadam writes, the B'shasat Chak yesh lahater al yedei any Yehudi. If it's a Shasat Chak, if you didn't add water to your animal fodder before Shabbos and now you're stuck, you could do this through the agency of an Eini Yehudi. She'Eini Yehudi yiten amayim b'Shabbos, the Eini Yehudi should add the water, via Gabel, and the Eini Yehudi should do the lush al yedei shinoi, employing a shinoi hanal. If we're dealing with hot water, water that's more than Yad Seledes, if we're dealing with hot water and you want to take hot water from a Kli Rishon and pour it onto Mursan, that would be an Issa Daraisa of Mavashel. Remember what we learned. When you have water or a liquid that's above the temperature of Yad Seledes and it's in a Kli Rishon, and you pour it onto something in another keli, it cooks it kidei klipa. It cooks the surface of that substance that you're pouring it on. So you can't ask an Eini Yehudi to do this. This would be Amir Alakum. You would have to have the Eini Yehudi first empty the hot water from the Kli Rishon into a Kli Sheni. And then pour it from the klisheni onto the mursan. V'dan, you should know, the mursan aniska b'shulchan aruch, when we're discussing mursan over here, what exactly are we talking about? Hu klipas hatvua, this is the outside, the peel, if you will, of the grain. Hanisheres banapa kishemanapa nesakemach. When we're talking here about mursan, we're talking about bran. So bran is the outside of the kernel. When we sift our wheat in order to produce white wheat, we sift out the bran. That's the mursan that we're talking about here. Olinian moitz, and when we're talking about moitz, olinian moitz hanisheres beis hadisha. We spoke about one kind of moitz, that was the inedible part of the top of the stalk of grain. Now the Mishnah Berurah is talking about another type of moitz. Olinian moitz hanisheres beis hadisha, the moitz that breaks off during the threshing process. The Shulchan Aruch hasn't been discussing it. Take a look at the Biur Halacha, very long Biur Halacha, Dibra Maskal Ein, on Kufnan Hey Amid Beis. You definitely should not add water to moitz on Shabbos. Many Rishonim hold that is an Issa Losh, the Araisa. Okay, we're going to stop over here. Thank you so much for joining me for Limud HaTorah. The source of Limud HaTorah should be megan against Klal Yisrael. The Rabban Shalom should say, Yeshua Sefuris Parnaset Sheduchim Tolos Need. We should be zeichet to see the Bias Tzedek B'mher of Yameinu Amen. Be well.